Ethan Carter had always believed that hard work, honor, and a commitment to one's community were worth fighting for. A decorated military veteran with scars that told stories of distant battlefields and long-forgotten wars, Ethan returned home with a single-minded determination to rebuild not just his life, but also the legacy his family had long cherished. That legacy was Carter's Lumber Yard, a weathered but proud establishment that had served as the heartbeat of local craftsmanship for generations. Nestled on the outskirts of a tidy suburban neighborhood, the lumber yard was far more than a business to Ethan. It was a living museum of tradition, a place where rough-hewn logs were transformed into the very beams that built families' homes and community landmarks. Every morning, as the early light spilled across stacks of timber and machinery roared to life, Ethan would walk the grounds with the measured pace of someone who understood that every board, every plank, carried the sweat and dedication of his forefathers. This yard was his sanctuary, his workshop of hope, and the symbol of his hard-won independence. But not everyone in the community shared Ethan's reverence for authenticity and legacy. In the nearby manicured streets, governed by strict homeowners association rules, one person reigned supreme as self-appointed arbiter of suburban perfection: Karen. As the HOA president, Karen had built her reputation on an unyielding commitment to an image, one of immaculate lawns, uniform siding, and a perfectly curated aesthetic. With her tailored suits, meticulously coiffed hair, and a clipboard always in hand, Karen patrolled her little kingdom with the intensity of a drill sergeant. To her, any deviation from the flawless template was not only unacceptable, it was an affront to the very idea of community order. One brisk autumn morning, as Ethan was busy overseeing a new shipment of premium timber, fate arranged an encounter that would change everything. At the edge of his yard, where the rugged world of lumber met the refined facades of suburban homes, Karen made her appearance, clutching a glossy notice and radiating an air of haughty authority. She approached with the steely gaze of someone convinced that she was the sole custodian of neighborhood standards. "Mr. Carter," Karen began, her tone clipped and imperious, "I'm here to inform you that your lumber yard is in violation of our community guidelines. The unsightly storage of lumber and the constant rumble of your machinery disrupt the harmony of our neighborhood. This is unacceptable." Ethan, wiping sawdust from his calloused hands, met her stare with a mixture of calm resolve and quiet indignation. "Karen," he replied slowly, "this yard has been in my family for decades. I run a legitimate business that supports local builders, renovators, and homeowners. I respect the neighborhood, but I won't allow arbitrary rules to threaten my livelihood." A murmur began to ripple among a small group of onlookers who had paused their morning routines to witness the confrontation. For many, Carter's lumber yard was an eyesore, but rather a vital institution, a reminder of genuine work and honest trade in a world increasingly obsessed with appearances. Yet to Karen, every stray beam and every truck's rumble was evidence of an unacceptable deviation from perfection. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter," Karen snapped, her eyes narrowing as she brandished the notice. "If you won't conform, then you leave me no choice but to enforce the regulations set by our HOA. I expect full compliance immediately." Ethan's jaw set in quiet determination. "I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood's image, but this yard isn't a community decoration. It's a working business. I'll comply with any regulation that's reasonable and legal. But I won't be bullied into changing how I operate just to satisfy your personal vision of suburbia." With that, Karen's lip curled into a self-satisfied smirk as she turned on her heel and strode back toward the neighborhood, leaving behind an unsettled silence and the first sparks of a conflict that would soon engulf them both. In that charged moment, Ethan realized that Karen's war on his lumber yard was not merely a dispute over aesthetics. It was an overreach of authority that threatened the very right of a hard-working citizen to earn an honest living. And he vowed to fight back, knowing that this battle would soon escalate beyond what either side could have imagined. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over timber stacks and oil-stained concrete, Ethan's thoughts churned with plans of resistance. What began as a minor annoyance had now taken on the form of a full-blown confrontation, a battle between the enduring spirit of a family business and the uncompromising, entitled dictates of an HOA obsessed with control. Little did Karen know that her attempt to silence him would soon spark a rebellion that would rally not just him, but an entire community ready to stand up against tyranny in the guise of rules. The following morning, Ethan woke to an unsettling discovery. A bright, official-looking envelope was taped to his office door at the lumber yard. With a sinking feeling, he peeled it off and unfolded the letter. The notice was damning, a $750 fine for violating community noise and visual standards. The letter detailed alleged infractions ranging from improper storage of lumber to excessive industrial activity in a residential zone. The tone was unmistakably punitive, and it bore the unmistakable seal of the HOA. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the legalistic jargon. He knew his operations were well within the law. The yard had been inspected multiple times by local authorities, and there had never been a complaint about safety or compliance. Yet here was Karen, using the power of the HOA to target him with arbitrary fines. Outside, on the cracked concrete pathway leading to the yard, Karen awaited him with a smug smile. Her arms were crossed, as if she were presiding over a courtroom rather than a suburban cul-de-sac. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said crisply. "I trust you received my notice. The rules apply to everyone, and it's my duty to ensure that no one undermines the integrity of our community." Ethan's voice remained steady as he replied, "Karen, I understand you have a job to do, but this fine is baseless. My lumber yard has operated within local zoning laws and environmental regulations for years. I suggest you review the actual statutes before issuing threats." Karen's eyes flashed, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a tone meant for both intimidation and persuasion. "I'm not interested in your interpretation of the rules, Mr. Carter. The HOA has its own standards, and you are in violation. I expect you to remove that unsightly display and modify your operations immediately, or face further penalties." Unwilling to be bullied by a board-appointed enforcer, Ethan calmly produced a well-thumbed folder containing copies of his permits, zoning approvals, and previous inspection reports. "As you can see," he said, sliding the folder toward her, "everything here is legally sound. I'm more than happy to work with the city officials if there's a real issue, but these fines appear to be nothing more than a power play." The onlookers, neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance, watched with mixed expressions of admiration and uncertainty. Many had long respected Ethan's dedication to his work, while others had been swayed by Karen's insistence on order and uniformity. Yet, as Ethan calmly countered Karen's threats with cold, irrefutable facts, murmurs of approval began to ripple through the crowd. But Karen was not one to back down. With a theatrical flourish, she declared, "If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to involve the city's inspectors. They will be sent immediately to document every infraction. And believe me, Mr. Carter, when they're done, you'll have more than just a fine to worry about." As if on cue, within hours, inspectors arrived at the yard. Their presence was both a reminder of bureaucratic might and a test of Ethan's resolve. Ethan greeted them cordially, providing all necessary documentation and inviting them to inspect every corner of the property. Throughout the day, the inspectors made notes and asked questions, while Karen lingered on the periphery with a self-satisfied air. By dusk, as the inspectors departed with polite nods and assurances that everything was in order, Ethan felt a mix of relief and foreboding. Karen's first power move had not only disrupted his day, but it set the tone for a confrontation that would soon escalate. That evening, as Ethan reviewed his paperwork and planned for the next steps, he couldn't help but feel that this was merely the opening act of a long and bitter battle between the unyielding forces of red tape and a man determined to protect his livelihood. In the quiet of his office, with the soft hum of machinery and distant calls of night birds as his soundtrack, Ethan made a promise to himself. He would not be cowed by baseless fines or empty threats. The lumber yard was his legacy, and he was prepared to stand up against every unjust regulation, even if it meant taking on the very institution that many in the community blindly revered. Karen might have thought that her letter and the presence of inspectors would force him into submission, but Ethan knew that true strength came not from obedience, but from the courage to question authority when it strayed into tyranny. As night settled over the yard and shadows danced among the stacks of timber, a silent war had begun, a battle not only for the survival of a business, but for the very soul of a community caught between the demands of conformity and the freedoms of hard work and independent enterprise. In the days that followed the fine, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. While Ethan had been prepared to address the apparent overreach, whispers among neighbors hinted that his troubles were far from over. Late one afternoon, as Ethan was finalizing orders for an urgent shipment, he received a discreet visit from a longtime resident of the neighborhood. The visitor, a soft-spoken board member named Michael, leaned in and confided, "There's been talk behind closed doors, Mr. Carter. Some of us have seen records. Karen's been using HOA funds for her own pet projects. And every time someone defies her, the complaints pile up mysteriously." Those words hit Ethan like a second volley of bullets. The fine for a so-called violation was merely the tip of an iceberg of abuse. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, he started an informal investigation. Under the pretext of routine maintenance, he discreetly set up cameras around the perimeter of the yard. He combed through old meeting minutes from HOA gatherings, uncovering a disturbing pattern of selective enforcement and unexplained expenses that pointed squarely to Karen's personal enrichment. One humid afternoon, while reviewing footage on his aging laptop, Ethan noticed something that confirmed his suspicions. In the dead of night, a figure cloaked in shadows could be seen slipping through the back gate of the community. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. Although the quality was grainy, the silhouette bore an uncanny resemblance to Karen herself. Could it be that the woman who prided herself on upholding the law was the very one breaking it? Fueled by the evidence, Ethan began speaking with other neighbors, quiet souls who had endured similar harassment. Over cups of strong coffee in dimly lit kitchens, stories emerged of mysterious fines, sudden inspections, and even hints that Karen had manipulated the board to settle personal scores. One elderly resident confided, "I've seen Karen pocket money meant for community beautification. I never thought she'd stoop so low, but now I see. She's playing favorites and punishing anyone who dares to live differently." The more Ethan learned, the more resolute he became. Every piece of evidence added another layer to the case against the HOA's crooked practices. In hushed tones and in the privacy of late-night meetings, he and a small band of like-minded neighbors began to plot a counteroffensive. They exchanged photocopies of documents, shared recordings of offhand remarks made during board meetings, and mapped out a timeline of Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. One evening, as a storm brewed outside and the rain pounded on the windows of the lumberyard's small office, Ethan sat surrounded by stacks of papers and digital files. His eyes, tired but burning with purpose, scanned through a report from the local zoning office. It confirmed that every regulation cited in Karen's fine was either misinterpreted or entirely fabricated. "This is more than just a personal vendetta," he murmured. "It's systemic corruption." Determined to take action, Ethan scheduled a meeting with a trusted attorney, someone who had once served as a mediator in municipal disputes. The attorney, a no-nonsense professional with decades of experience in municipal law, assured Ethan that the evidence was damning. "Your case isn't just about one fine," the attorney said, tapping a thick dossier on the desk. "It's about abuse of power. We can file for an injunction and bring a class action suit if necessary. Karen's tactics are not only unethical, they're illegal." Armed with legal backing and the support of increasingly vocal community members, Ethan began to prepare his public counterattack. Every day, he updated his digital archive of recordings, photos, and documents. Every evening, he convened with his small coalition of neighbors, sharing the latest discoveries and planning their next move. The once silent grievances of the community were beginning to rise in a crescendo of collective anger. As the investigation progressed, the local media started to take notice. A small-town reporter, intrigued by the swirling rumors of HOA corruption, began asking questions. Soon, snippets of the story emerged in community newsletters and local blogs, painting a picture of an HOA that had long strayed from its intended purpose, protecting the neighborhood, to become a tool for personal vendettas and unchecked authority. In that charged atmosphere, Ethan realized that his struggle was no longer just his own. It was a battle for every homeowner who had ever felt the sting of arbitrary punishment, for every business owner who believed in the right to operate freely, and for every citizen who refused to let entitlement go unchecked. With evidence mounting and public sentiment shifting, the stage was set for an epic confrontation, a reckoning that promised to expose the true face of corruption lurking behind the polished veneer of suburbia. Just as Ethan thought he had the upper hand with his carefully collected evidence, Karen's tactics grew ever more brazen. One chilly morning, before dawn had fully broken, Ethan arrived at the lumber yard only to find a surreal scene. Heavy machinery and a tow truck had been stationed at the entrance. The barricade wasn't a scheduled delivery. This was an outright attempt to halt operations. Karen had allegedly authorized the sudden removal of several trucks parked along the lot, citing a temporary safety hazard that conveniently violated obscure HOA regulations. Ethan rushed outside, heart pounding. There, amidst a chorus of blaring horns and the clamor of construction equipment, Karen stood with an officious smile. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she called out, as if greeting an old friend rather than confronting a foe. "We've determined that your current operations pose an imminent danger to the community. The trucks must be relocated immediately." The sight was absurd. Massive pieces of equipment, intended for use on public roads, now enforcing Karen's vision of suburban perfection. With measured anger, Ethan calmly informed her, "This is not a safety issue. It's an abuse of authority. I have permits, and my operations are safe and approved. You have no right to commandeer my business." But Karen was unmoved. "You leave me no choice, Mr. Carter. I have notified the city, and legal action is forthcoming," she declared, her voice echoing over the din. As neighbors gathered, murmuring their shock and support, Ethan realized that silence was no longer an option. It was time to fight back publicly. Without hesitation, he gathered every document he'd amassed, the inspection reports, zoning approvals, the damning video footage of late-night intrusions, and even the suspicious financial ledgers implicating Karen. That very afternoon, at the next scheduled HOA meeting, a gathering that had always been a carefully choreographed display of decorum, Ethan strode into the boardroom with a determined glint in his eye and a bulky folder clutched under his arm. The room fell into an expectant hush as Ethan set up a portable projector. With a few clicks, the evidence he'd gathered illuminated the screen. Images of unauthorized towing, excerpts from meeting minutes that revealed unexplained financial transactions, and even grainy video clips capturing Karen's late-night forays into his property. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the assembled homeowners, many of whom had long harbored secret doubts about the HOA's management, watched in disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice steady and resolute, "what you're seeing isn't the result of necessary community upkeep. It's an orchestrated effort by our HOA leadership to silence any business or homeowner who dares to live and work on their own terms. I stand before you not only as a lumber yard owner, but as a member of this community who believes that fairness and accountability must prevail." Karen's face reddened as she attempted to interject, but a murmur of protest from the audience cut her off. Some board members exchanged uneasy glances, others shifted in their seats, clearly rethinking their blind allegiance. This isn't what it looks like," Karen stuttered, but her protest was drowned out by Ethan's unwavering clarity and the mounting evidence. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's grip on the HOA was weakening. Homeowners demanded explanations and accountability. Ethan's public showdown had exposed not only the injustice inflicted on him, but also a pattern of corruption that extended well beyond his lumber yard. In that charged moment, the community's long-suppressed frustrations found a voice, and a collective determination to reclaim their neighborhood began to take shape. As the meeting adjourned in a flurry of whispered conversations and determined exchanges of contact information, Ethan felt both vindicated and resolute. He knew that Karen's extreme measures would only lead to further escalation, and that the community was now poised to challenge the very foundation of an HOA that had lost sight of its true purpose. With his evidence in hand and the support of his neighbors, Ethan was ready to push back harder than ever before, determined to protect not only his legacy, but also the rights of every homeowner to live without the shadow of arbitrary tyranny. The intensity of the battle escalated quickly. As word spread about Ethan's exposé at the HOA meeting, Karen's actions grew ever more desperate. One late evening, while the neighborhood slept under a star-studded sky, Karen made her most audacious move yet. Armed with her phone and a determination born of desperation, she dialed the local police station. Her voice, trembling with false indignation, crackled over the line as she reported a public disturbance emanating from Ethan's lumberyard. "I repeat," she insisted to the dispatcher, "the noise from that yard is causing a nuisance. It's a threat to public safety." In truth, Karen's claim was a feeble attempt to distract from her own mounting misdeeds, a way to paint Ethan as a reckless troublemaker while she manipulated the system from behind the scenes. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet night. 2 patrol cars rolled onto the property, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Ethan, who had been poring over documents in his modest office, heard the commotion and rushed outside. Standing beneath the harsh glare of floodlights, he calmly approached the officers, badge in hand as a retired city official. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said politely. "How may I assist you?" Karen, seizing the moment, emerged from the shadows with a look of forced concern. "Officers, I'm here because this man's operations are a public hazard," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the lumberyard. "His machinery, the noise, the disruption, it's all out of line." But the officers, familiar with Ethan's long-standing reputation and having reviewed the yard's records during previous inspections, exchanged skeptical looks. One of them asked, "Can you provide any evidence of a disturbance, ma'am?" Before Karen could recover, Ethan interjected, "I'd like to point out that every claim being made tonight has been documented and disproven. In fact, if you review your records, you'll find that all operations here are within legal limits." Sensing the tide turning, Karen's voice wavered as she stuttered, "That's not the point." But the officers cut her off. One officer, having quietly observed the tense standoff, said, "We have reason to believe there's more to this situation than meets the eye. We'll need to review any footage or records before taking further action." As the officers began to investigate, Ethan discreetly handed them a flash drive containing the very evidence he had compiled: security footage, documents, and audio recordings of previous HOA meetings. The footage, including a particularly damning clip of Karen sneaking onto the property under dubious circumstances, left little room for doubt. Within hours, the tide of public opinion began to shift even more dramatically. The police confirmed that no legitimate disturbance had occurred and that Karen's call appeared to be a deliberate act to intimidate and disrupt. By morning, local news outlets had caught wind of the incident. Headlines began to appear questioning the legitimacy of Karen's authority, and community members who had once been on the fence were now fully behind Ethan's cause. At the next HOA meeting, now packed with outraged homeowners, Ethan took the stage once more. "Last night, Karen tried one final desperate stunt," he said, his voice ringing clear as he recounted the events. "She thought that by involving law enforcement, she could paint me as a criminal and distract from the corruption we've uncovered. But you see, the truth always comes to light." With a flash drive and live testimony from a couple of police officers who had since visited the scene, Ethan laid bare every transgression. Karen's face turned ashen as murmurs of discontent filled the room. The evidence was irrefutable. The community, once divided by superficial concerns, now stood united in outrage. Her desperate measures had backfired spectacularly. As neighbors called for accountability, it became painfully clear that Karen's days as the unchallenged enforcer of HOA rules were numbered. The battle had reached its climax, and Ethan's relentless pursuit of justice had turned the very system meant to control him into an instrument of his vindication. The fallout from Karen's final move was swift and unforgiving. In the wake of the explosive HOA meeting and the subsequent media storm, the community began to mobilize. Homeowners who had once quietly complied with Karen's edicts now gathered in numbers, determined to reclaim their neighborhood from the grip of tyranny. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time in years, the board of directors was forced to confront the corruption festering within their ranks. In that charged atmosphere, voices rose in unison demanding accountability. "We deserve transparency," one homeowner shouted. "We deserve to live without fear of arbitrary fines and intimidation." The meeting hall, usually a sterile room filled with polite nods and cautious smiles, transformed into a battleground for truth. With Ethan at the forefront, folder in hand, evidence projected for all to see, the homeowners reviewed the documents and footage that exposed Karen's misuse of HOA funds, her secretive meetings, and her personal vendettas. One by one, board members, previously silent or complicit, began to speak out. "I wasn't aware of these transactions," admitted one member, his voice shaking with regret. "I trusted Karen to uphold the rules in a fair manner." Others echoed similar sentiments, until the overwhelming consensus was that the system itself had been manipulated by one individual's unchecked ambition. Faced with mounting evidence and the unyielding determination of the community, the board had no choice but to take decisive action. In a historic vote that would be remembered as the day the HOA finally answered to the people, Karen was formally ousted from her position. The vote was nearly unanimous, a resounding repudiation of everything she had stood for. As the final tally was announced, the room erupted in applause and cheers. Karen, her authority completely stripped away, could only watch in stunned silence as her carefully constructed empire crumbled before her eyes. Within days, the fallout intensified. News of the board's decision spread like wildfire, and local authorities announced that they would be launching a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Karen's personal residence, once a symbol of her power, was thrust into the spotlight as details of financial mismanagement and fraudulent activities emerged. Neighbors discovered that the funds she had funneled into community projects were, in fact, diverted into her personal bank accounts. Ethan, now seen as the reluctant hero of the community, maintained his humble demeanor throughout the turmoil. Every morning, as he unlocked the gates to his beloved lumber yard, he did so with a quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought for justice and won. Sipping his coffee on a sunlit porch, he allowed himself a brief moment of pride, knowing that his stand against overreach had set a precedent for every homeowner who believed in fairness. In the days and weeks that followed, the remnants of the former HOA were forced to undergo a complete restructuring. New board members were elected, individuals chosen not for their pedigree or entitlement, but for their commitment to transparency and community welfare. The once feared rules were rewritten to reflect the real needs and values of the neighborhood. And amid all the changes, one message rang clear: entitlement would no longer be tolerated. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. The battle had been long and arduous, and scars, both physical and emotional, reminded him of the cost of standing up against injustice. Yet the transformation that had swept through the community offered a glimmer of hope for a future where business and personal freedom could coexist without undue interference. As the community began to heal, Ethan's lumber yard stood as a living monument to the power of resilience and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to be cowed by tyranny. In the aftermath of the upheaval, the local government moved swiftly to address the systemic issues within the HOA. An independent investigation was launched into the entire organization, and it wasn't long before multiple legal actions were filed. The city fined the HOA for illegally enforcing regulations that had no legal basis, and several board members found themselves embroiled in lawsuits for financial mismanagement. Ethan played a pivotal role in this final phase of the battle. With his attorney by his side, he helped organize a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the wronged homeowners. The legal case, backed by the mountain of evidence gathered over months, painted a damning picture of a corrupt system that had exploited the trust of a community for far too long. The headlines that followed were unflinching, stories of a once trusted HOA brought down by its own excesses and a courageous individual who had dared to challenge the status quo. As court dates were set and testimonies collected, the community watched with cautious optimism. For many, this was more than just a legal victory. It was a reclamation of their right to self-determination. The investigations led to tighter regulations and reforms designed to prevent any future abuse of power. Even the state bar took notice when it began scrutinizing the actions of Karen's longtime legal advisor, whose questionable tactics had once helped shield her from accountability. By the time the first legal judgments were announced, the full extent of the HOA's misdeeds was laid bare for all to see. The organization was fined millions of dollars, and several of its former leaders faced criminal charges. Ethan's final power move, uncompromising, relentless, and firmly rooted in justice, had forced a complete collapse of the system that had once intimidated an entire community. With the legal noose tightening around her, Karen's personal life began to unravel at an alarming rate. The media, now fully engaged in the scandal, portrayed her not as a stalwart guardian of community standards, but as a vindictive opportunist whose personal ambition had blinded her to the truth. Public opinion turned swiftly against her, and every misstep was magnified under the harsh glare of scrutiny. Within weeks, Karen found herself isolated. Her once esteemed position evaporated, and her finances, bolstered by ill-gotten gains from misdirected HOA funds, began to crumble. Neighbors who once trembled under her authority now watched with a mix of satisfaction and relief as she was forced to sell her luxurious home, a symbol of her misguided power, to settle mounting debts. Even her personal relationships suffered. Whispers of infidelity and mismanagement spread, and soon her husband filed for divorce, unwilling to be associated with the scandal any longer. Karen's final public appearance was a pitiful one, at a city council meeting, where she attempted to defend herself. Her voice cracked under the weight of evidence and community scorn. As she fumbled through her words, the audience's murmurs of disbelief and derision were impossible to ignore. In that moment, the mighty enforcer of HOA regulations was reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of unchecked entitlement. Ethan, ever the quiet observer of his own small triumph, could only shake his head with a wry smile. "Justice has a way of finding us all," he remarked to a friend as he passed by, a final remark that encapsulated the poetic justice of the entire ordeal. Karen, once so determined to control every aspect of the neighborhood, had become nothing more than a footnote in a story of resilience and community empowerment. Some months later, the neighborhood had settled into a newfound harmony. The reformed HOA now operated transparently, its policies reflecting the true spirit of community collaboration rather than authoritarian dictate. Homeowners strolled their streets with a sense of liberation, their voices finally heard in meetings where ideas, rather than edicts, shaped decisions. Ethan Carter, the unlikely hero of this saga, returned to his daily routine at the lumber yard with a quiet pride. Each morning, as the sun broke over neatly stacked timbers and the hum of machinery became the day's soundtrack, he was reminded not only of his own perseverance, but of the community that had rallied behind him. Neighbors would occasionally stop by to exchange pleasantries or share a light-hearted joke about the old days, a time when one person's entitlement nearly cast a long shadow over their lives. One crisp afternoon, as Ethan sat on his porch enjoying a cup of coffee, a young neighbor strolled by holding an old, faded piece of paper. With a playful grin, the youngster said, "Mr. Carter, check this out. Another HOA violation notice. They say your yard is too inspiring." Laughter rippled through the small group gathered on the porch, a sound that was as much a celebration of freedom as it was a mockery of a once feared regime. Ethan merely smiled, savoring the moment of poetic justice. "They really tried," he mused, his tone light yet resolute. In that simple remark lay the triumph of a community that had reclaimed its dignity, a triumph born of unity, courage, and the unwavering belief that no one should be bullied into conformity. As the scene faded into a warm sunset, the story of Ethan Carter and his defiant lumber yard became a local legend, a reminder that even in the face of relentless entitlement, the spirit of justice and the strength of a united community will always prevail. And so, with a final mic drop delivered by a quiet nod and a knowing smile, the chapter closed on an era of oppression, ushering in a future where everyone had the right to live, work, and dream on their own terms.